Welcome to Wildlife for Sleep, a place where ancient oceans breathe slowly, where shadows drift beneath the waves, and where stories are told, not to awaken the mind but to gently quiet it if these facts help you relax or slowly drift into sleep. Please like the video, subscribe to Wildlife for Sleep, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps this channel continue creating peaceful, slow science-inspired sleep documentaries. Now settle into a comfortable position, let your breathing soften, and allow the surface world to fade away. Tonight we descend into the deepest waters of the sea. In every scientific model of origin, there is first an absence, an interval before structure, before differentiation, before direction. And whether modern cosmology describes that absence through quantum fluctuation and inflationary fields, or ancient cultures describe it through story and metaphor, the pattern remains remarkably consistent. Creation does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates slowly, patiently, through gradients of energy and temperature, through imbalance seeking equilibrium, and long before medieval scribes committed Norse myths to parchment in works such as the Prose Edda, the peoples of Scandinavia already carried within their oral traditions a strikingly physical vision of beginnings, centered on a primordial void known as Jörmungandr, a conceptual space defined not by emptiness alone, but by tension, by the measurable distance between cold and heat, between stillness and motion. And in modern terms, this framing feels less like fantasy and more like an intuitive grasp of thermodynamics. Because even today, physicists describe the early universe not as a featureless nothingness, but as a dynamic field where contrasts drive emergence, where gradients generate motion, and where structure arises precisely because perfect balance does not exist. Jörmungandr in the Norse worldview lay between two opposing domains. Niflheim, a region of intense cold, mist, and frozen rivers, and Muspelheim, a realm of radiant heat and combustion. And although these locations were described mythologically, their underlying logic mirrors principles now fundamental to Earth and planetary sciences. Because temperature differentials are among the most powerful engines of change in any system, driving atmospheric circulation, ocean currents, tectonic behavior, and even stellar evolution. And so when Norse storytellers imagined frost meeting flame across a vast intermediate space, they were effectively describing a proto-scientific model of phase transition, a zone where matter changes state, where ice melts into water, where vapor condenses into liquid, and where complexity begins to assemble itself from simpler components. In this early cosmology, it was the slow drift of warmth from Muspelheim into the frozen vapors of Niflheim that initiated the first transformations. And while the language is symbolic, the process itself is recognizable to anyone who studies physical systems today. Energy moving into colder regions causes instability. Instability produces structure, and structure becomes the scaffold upon which increasingly complex forms are built. And this is not merely poetic coincidence, because human observation of nature, of glaciers retreating under sunlight, of rivers forming where snow melts, of storms arising from warm seas meeting cool air, had already taught ancient communities that creation is rarely explosive, but instead incremental, emerging from contact zones where opposites interact over time. From a scientific perspective, origin stories serve as cultural memory, encoding environmental knowledge into narrative, and for the early Nordic world, survival depended on reading landscapes shaped by ice, ocean, and seasonal fire. And so their cosmology naturally emphasized these elements, presenting the universe itself as an extension of familiar processes, scaled to infinity. And within this framework, life does not appear as a miraculous interruption of nature, but as its inevitable consequence, arising wherever energy flows persist long enough to allow complexity to stabilize. And so we linger here, in this first conceptual environment, not because it contains monsters or gods, but because it establishes the physical conditions necessary for everything that follows. Because before serpents can coil around worlds, before oceans can carry memory, before even land can harden into continents, there must first be gradients, exchanges, and transitions. And it is precisely in these transitional spaces that both biology and mythology locate their beginnings. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavia shows that by the late Bronze Age, communities already possessed sophisticated understandings of seasonal cycles, solar movement, and maritime navigation. And these observational skills fed directly into cosmological thinking, producing a worldview where the universe itself behaved like an immense ecological system, responsive to temperature, moisture, and motion. And in this sense, Jörmungandr can be read not as a supernatural abyss, but as an early attempt to conceptualize pre-structure, a mental model of a universe before differentiation, similar in spirit, if not in mathematics, to modern hypotheses about cosmic inflation and symmetry breaking. What is especially notable is that Norse cosmology does not begin with light alone, nor with sound, nor with divine command, but with environment, with climate, with physical conditions. And this emphasis reflects the lived reality of northern latitudes, where survival depends on understanding cold, respecting fire, and navigating long periods of darkness punctuated by brief, intense summers. And so creation itself becomes climatological, shaped by the interaction of elemental forces rather than by abstract decree. As heat advanced into ice within Jörmungandr, the myths describe the formation of the first proto-beings, not yet gods, not yet animals, but transitional forms arising from melting frost and condensed vapor. And while these figures are often treated symbolically, their emergence aligns closely with what biologists now recognize as abiogenesis, the process by which life arises from non-living matter under suitable chemical and energetic conditions. And although Norse storytellers lacked microscopes or molecular theory, they nevertheless placed life's origin within zones of mixing, where temperature gradients facilitate chemical reactions, exactly as contemporary science does when investigating hydrothermal vents or prebiotic environments on early Earth. The documentary perspective requires us to slow down here, to resist the urge to rush forward into drama, because this chapter is not about action. It is about setup, about environmental preconditions, about the slow accumulation of complexity across immense timescales. And it is within this patience that the deeper meaning of the myth emerges, because the Norse did not imagine their universe as static or finished, but as perpetually forming, perpetually destabilizing, always moving toward new equilibria. And this dynamic worldview will later become essential for understanding why their myths culminate not in eternal stasis, but in cyclical destruction and renewal. And so, in this long prelude to existence, oceans have not yet formed. Gravity has not yet organized matter into spheres, and no serpent yet traces the boundaries of the world. But the conditions that will eventually give rise to such forms are already present, embedded in gradients of heat and cold, in flows of energy across empty space, and in the simple physical truth that whenever differences exist, movement follows. And it is within this movement, quiet at first, almost imperceptible, that the architecture of future worlds begins to take shape. In the chapters ahead, these early environmental interactions will crystallize into oceans and continents, into ecosystems and mythic genealogies, and eventually into the emergence of a vast marine boundary creature whose body will come to define the limits of human imagination. But for now, we remain here, in the silence before creation, watching energy drift across primordial distance, watching structure slowly assemble itself from contrast, and recognizing that even the most legendary beings begin not with roar or prophecy, but with temperature, with space, and with time. To understand how a mythic ocean serpent could one day be imagined as circling the world, we must first return to environment. Because in Norse cosmology, creation does not begin with speech or light, but with climate, with temperature gradients, and with the slow negotiation between opposing physical states, a worldview preserved most clearly in medieval sources like the Prose Edda, yet grounded in far older oral traditions shaped by life in high latitudes, where ice defines geography, fire defines survival, and the sea defines connection. At the center of this early model stands Jörmungandr, not a simple emptiness but a dynamic boundary zone, a vast intermediary space positioned between two extremes. Niflheim to the north, a region of cold vapor, frozen rivers, and persistent mist, and Muspelheim to the south, a domain of radiant heat, combustion, and expansion. Modern readers often interpret these as purely symbolic realms, yet when examined through the lens of environmental science, they resemble something far more concrete, a conceptual model of phase transition, where matter changes state because energy is moving unevenly across space. In contemporary physics and Earth systems science, gradients drive everything. Temperature differences power atmospheric circulation. Salinity differences drive ocean currents. Pressure differences generate wind. Even plate tectonics at its deepest level is governed by thermal imbalance inside Earth's mantle. The Norse storytellers, observing glaciers retreat in summer, rivers forming from meltwater, and storms rising when warm seas met cold air, embedded this same logic into their cosmology. Creation begins not with perfection, but with asymmetry. Jörmungandr, then, functions less like a supernatural abyss and more like an early intuitive framework for instability, a region where contrasting conditions meet and therefore produce structure. As warmth from Muspelheim drifted northward and encountered the frozen vapors of Niflheim, the myths describe ice beginning to melt, droplets forming, and motion emerging from stillness. Scientifically, this mirrors what happens whenever energy enters a cold system. Molecular activity increases, bonds loosen, and matter becomes mobile. In modern terms, it is precisely such environments, interfaces between hot and cold, wet and dry, solid and liquid, that foster complexity. We see this today in hydrothermal vent ecosystems, where mineral-rich hot water rises into cold oceans, creating localized chemical gradients that support entire biological communities independent of sunlight. Many researchers studying abiogenesis, the origin of life, focus on these transitional zones because they provide sustained energy flow, catalytic surfaces, and repeated cycles of concentration and dilution. Remarkably, Norse cosmology places its first transformations in exactly this kind of setting. The myths speak of early proto-forms arising from the melting frost within Jörmungandr, figures that are neither gods nor animals in any modern sense, but transitional beings, expressions of matter organizing itself under new conditions. While these accounts are symbolic, their structure reflects a realistic understanding of emergence. Life does not appear fully formed. It evolves through stages, shaped by environment. This aligns with what biology now demonstrates through fossil records and molecular phylogenetics. Complex organisms arise gradually from simpler precursors, driven by external pressures and internal adaptation. For the early Scandinavian world, this environmental framing was not abstract philosophy. Archaeological evidence from Bronze Age and Iron Age sites across Norway, Sweden, and Denmark reveals societies deeply attuned to seasonal cycles, solar movement, and maritime patterns. Rock carvings depict ships, solar symbols, and animals in ritual procession. Settlement locations track coastlines and river mouths. Survival depended on reading ice conditions, anticipating storms, and understanding how heat could be conserved during long winters. It is therefore unsurprising that their creation story begins not with divine proclamation, but with climate. This also explains why Norse cosmology emphasizes process over permanence. The universe is not presented as a finished artifact. It is portrayed as an evolving system. Matter condenses, forces interact, structures emerge, and crucially, everything remains subject to change. This dynamic worldview contrasts sharply with traditions that depict creation as a single completed act. In the Norse model, formation is continuous and dissolution is inevitable, a perspective that resonates strongly with modern systems theory, where stability is always temporary and equilibrium is always provisional. As energy continued to flow across Jörmungandr, the myths describe the gradual organization of space itself. Distinction emerges where none existed before. Regions acquire identity. Direction becomes meaningful. From a scientific standpoint, this reflects the fundamental transition from homogeneity to structure, a process cosmologists describe in terms of symmetry breaking in the early universe, when initially uniform energy fields differentiated into the forces and particles that now shape reality. But for the Norse storytellers, this was expressed through landscape, fog giving way to form, ice yielding to water, and heat carving pathways through resistance. Creation is environmental before it is theological. The cosmos behaves like weather on a grand scale. This perspective carries important implications for understanding later figures such as Jörmungandr, because within this framework, even the most immense beings are not external to nature. They are expressions of it. The world serpent does not arrive as an alien invader of reality. It emerges from the same processes that shaped oceans and continents. Its future role as a planetary boundary is prefigured here, in the idea that form arises wherever forces meet. And so, Chapter 2 is less about characters and more about conditions. It is about gradients. It is about interfaces. It is about the slow choreography of energy moving through matter. We pause here deliberately because modern documentary science teaches us that origins are rarely dramatic in the way stories expect. They are quiet, incremental, distributed across vast spans of time. They unfold in millimeters per year, in degrees per season, in chemical reactions too small to see. In Jörmungandr, the Norse imagined such a process on a cosmic scale, cold yielding to warmth, stillness yielding to motion, and undifferentiated space yielding to structure. This is the laboratory in which their universe was assembled. And it is from this laboratory, this ancient meeting place of ice and fire, that seas will eventually collect, lands will rise, ecosystems will form, and the conditions necessary for a world-encircling serpent will quietly come into being. Not yet, but soon. By the time structure begins to settle across the Norse cosmos, by the time seas have imagined their basins and land has learned how to rise, the mythology introduces a new layer of complexity. Lineage, inheritance, and consequence, because in systems both biological and cultural, once environments stabilize, evolution accelerates, and relationships begin to matter. It is here that the narrative turns toward genealogy, toward the transmission of traits across generations, and toward a figure whose role is less about creation and more about disruption. Loki, a character who functions not as a villain in the modern sense, but as a catalyst, an agent of instability whose presence mirrors what ecologists would call a disturbance factor, the kind of influence that reshapes systems by introducing unpredictability. From a scientific perspective, ecosystems do not thrive on equilibrium alone. They require disturbance, fires, floods, migrations, genetic mutation, to prevent stagnation. Loki occupies this same conceptual niche in Norse cosmology. He is not purely destructive, he is transformational. His actions introduce variation into otherwise orderly structures, and it is through this variation that new forms emerge. This framing becomes essential when we examine the beings collectively known as Loki's children, because they are not random monsters inserted for spectacle. They represent boundary conditions, biological extremes, and existential stress tests for the cosmos itself. The myths preserved in sources like the Prose Edda describe Loki's union with the giantess Angerboda as producing three extraordinary offspring: Fenrir, Hel, and Jörmungandr. Each embodies a different domain: land, death, and sea, and together they form a triad that maps remarkably well onto fundamental ecological zones. Fenrir represents terrestrial force, predation, and unchecked growth. Hel governs decay, mortality, and recycling of matter. Jörmungandr occupies the oceanic boundary, regulating the interface between world and abyss. In systems science, this division is striking. Land, sea, and decomposition are not poetic abstractions. They are the primary pillars of planetary regulation. Terrestrial ecosystems generate biomass. Marine systems regulate climate and nutrient cycles. Decomposition returns material to circulation. Loki's children, viewed through this lens, resemble mythologized expressions of Earth system processes, each one necessary, each one dangerous if left unconstrained. The Norse gods, collectively known as the Aesir, are said to have recognized this danger early, not because these beings were inherently evil, but because they represented scales of power that exceeded normal containment. In ecological terms, they were apex forces, capable of destabilizing the entire system if allowed to grow unchecked. Modern parallels exist in invasive species, runaway climate feedback loops, or unregulated predators introduced into fragile environments. Once thresholds are crossed, balance becomes difficult to restore. Fenrir's story illustrates this principle most directly. The wolf grows rapidly, exceeding all expectations, until the gods attempt containment through progressively stronger restraints. An allegory that resonates with modern conservation biology, where late intervention often proves insufficient once exponential growth has begun. Hel, by contrast, is assigned dominion over the dead, institutionalizing decay rather than resisting it, integrating mortality into cosmic order. And Jörmungandr is cast into the ocean, where its growth can be distributed across vast space, buffered by the immensity of water. This decision to place the serpent in the sea is not arbitrary. Oceans cover more than 70% of Earth's surface. They absorb heat, store carbon, generate oxygen, and circulate nutrients. They are both cradle and grave. By assigning Jörmungandr to this domain, Norse cosmology effectively situates the most expansive of Loki's offspring within the planet's most expansive system. From a scientific standpoint, this makes intuitive sense. The ocean is where scale disappears. It is where boundaries blur. It is where individual entities become currents, and where local actions propagate globally. Any being destined to encircle the world must belong to a medium capable of such continuity. The myths describe Jörmungandr growing until it becomes large enough to bite its own tail, forming a complete ring around Midgard, the human world. While this image is often treated symbolically, it reflects a sophisticated understanding of enclosure and feedback. In Earth system science, feedback loops are processes where outputs circle back as inputs, reinforcing or stabilizing behavior. Ocean currents, atmospheric circulation, and carbon cycles all operate this way. The serpent biting its own tail becomes a visual metaphor for planetary scale feedback. What is especially notable is that Loki's children are not destroyed when they become threatening. They are redistributed. Fenrir is bound. Hel is assigned jurisdiction. Jörmungandr is submerged. This reflects a management strategy rather than extermination, a recognition that certain forces cannot be eliminated, only constrained and integrated. Modern environmental policy echoes this logic when dealing with wildfires, predators, or flooding. Suppression alone fails. Adaptive coexistence becomes necessary. And so, Chapter 3 marks a transition from formation to regulation. The universe now contains actors whose scale rivals the systems that produced them. Biological analogy becomes unavoidable. Once life reaches sufficient complexity, it begins to reshape its environment. Apex predators alter prey populations. Forests change atmospheric composition. Humans modify climate. Loki's children represent this tipping point in mythic form, creations that begin to act back upon creation. We pause again here because this is where the documentary lens sharpens. These are no longer abstract forces. These are system-level entities, introduced to explore what happens when growth meets limitation, when emergence meets containment. Jörmungandr, still young at this stage, has not yet claimed the horizon. But the conditions for that future are already in place. The oceans have accepted it. The gods have released it. The feedback loop has begun. In the next chapter, we will follow the serpent into the deep, tracing how environment shapes anatomy, how pressure and darkness influence form, and how a creature cast into infinity learns slowly to become its boundary. The decision to release Jörmungandr into the ocean is recorded most clearly in medieval sources such as the Prose Edda. Yet its deeper meaning lies not in the act itself, but in the environment chosen, because in any system, mythic or scientific, where you place a growing force determines what it will become. And the sea, more than any other domain, is a medium that reshapes everything that enters it. From a modern earth science perspective, oceans are not empty expanses. They are structured, layered, and dynamic, governed by pressure gradients, temperature stratification, salinity differences, and slow planetary circulation. Light penetrates only the uppermost fraction. Below that lies a realm of cold stability, immense pressure, and near total darkness. Any organism consigned to this environment must adapt to extremes: crushing force, minimal visibility, and vast distances between resources. Over evolutionary timescales, such conditions produce elongated bodies, slow metabolisms, heightened sensory systems, and a dependence on currents rather than limbs. This is the setting into which the young serpent is cast. The myth describes no ceremony, no farewell, only a release, a downward trajectory into cold water, and the quiet closing of surface waves above it. Documentary science invites us to linger here, because this moment represents a transition from terrestrial narrative into oceanic process. Once submerged, growth is no longer constrained by visible horizons. Scale becomes abstract. Direction dissolves. In the deep sea, there is no up or down in any meaningful sense, only gradients of pressure and temperature. For ancient Nordic cultures, the ocean was already a place of profound ambiguity. It provided food and trade routes, yet claimed ships without warning. It connected distant lands, yet erased bodies without trace. Archaeological evidence shows that Scandinavian societies were accomplished mariners by the Bronze Age, navigating open waters with remarkable precision. Yet they also understood that beyond a certain distance, the sea ceased to be knowable. Storm systems could form rapidly. Fog could erase landmarks. Depth could not be measured. This dual nature, provider and devourer, made the ocean an ideal domain for a being destined to exist at the edge of comprehension. From a systems perspective, placing Jörmungandr in the sea accomplishes something crucial. It distributes its growth across a planetary scale medium. On land, size encounters resistance, mountains, forests, settlements. In the ocean, continuity dominates. Currents link hemispheres. Temperature bands circle the globe. Nutrients migrate thousands of kilometers. Any organism capable of integrating into this network gains access to the entire planetary perimeter. Modern oceanography confirms this connectivity. Thermohaline circulation, sometimes called the global conveyor belt, moves water masses across basins over centuries, redistributing heat and chemistry. Biological material travels with these flows, from plankton to larvae. Even pollutants released in one region can appear in another decades later. The sea is not fragmented. It is a single, circulating body. Within this context, the image of a serpent eventually encircling the world becomes less fantastical. It reflects an intuitive understanding of global marine continuity. The myths describe Jörmungandr growing steadily after entering the deep, feeding on what the ocean provides, expanding along coastlines and continental shelves, following currents and trenches, until its body traces the outer margins of Midgard itself. This is not explosive growth. It is gradual, distributed, and adaptive, much like real marine megafauna, whose size emerges over generations in response to ecological opportunity rather than sudden mutation. In biology, large body size in aquatic environments is common because buoyancy offsets gravity. Whales reach lengths impossible on land. Giant squids thrive in abyssal darkness. Even ancient reptiles such as ichthyosaurs achieved extreme proportions once freed from terrestrial constraints. Water permits scale. Pressure, too, becomes a shaping force. At depths of several kilometers, pressure exceeds hundreds of atmospheres. Any organism surviving there must possess flexible tissues, reinforced membranes, and slow, efficient circulation. The serpent of myth, dwelling across such gradients, becomes less a creature in the conventional sense and more a distributed organism, a living boundary layer adapting to every zone it inhabits. This reframes Jörmungandr not as a single localized monster, but as an environmental phenomenon, a continuous biological presence integrated into the oceanic system. The Norse storytellers expressed this integration through the powerful image of the serpent biting its own tail, forming a closed loop around the world. In scientific language, this resembles a feedback system, a circular process where outputs return as inputs. Oceans regulate climate through evaporation and precipitation. Carbon cycles through sea and atmosphere. Heat absorbed in equatorial waters is released in higher latitudes. These loops stabilize planetary conditions, yet they can also amplify change when thresholds are crossed. Jörmungandr embodies this duality. As long as it remains coiled, the system holds. When it moves, consequences propagate. We pause again here because this chapter is about immersion, not just of the serpent, but of the narrative itself. We have crossed from sky and land into deep water, from genealogy into environment, from origin into distribution. The casting into the deep marks the moment when Jörmungandr ceases to be merely Loki's offspring and begins to become a planetary boundary. It is no longer defined by lineage alone, but by currents, pressure, temperature, and time. Above, storms continue to form. Ice advances and retreats. Human settlements rise along coasts. Below, in darkness, something vast is learning the shape of the world. Slowly, silently, following gradients no eye can see. In the next chapter, we will examine how this submerged growth reshapes Midgard itself, how coastlines become limits, how oceans become walls, and how a creature hidden beneath waves comes to define the horizon of human existence. As the serpent continued its silent expansion through the global ocean, a transformation unfolded that the Norse expressed through myth, but which modern science recognizes as boundary formation. The moment when a growing system begins to define limits, when movement becomes architecture, and when distributed processes coalesce into structure, because at planetary scale, nothing meaningful exists without borders, whether those borders are tectonic plates, atmospheric layers, or oceanic fronts. And it is precisely here, at this threshold between motion and containment, that Jörmungandr completes its transition from organism to environment. The myths describe the serpent eventually becoming so vast that it encircles Midgard, biting its own tail and forming a continuous ring around the human realm. This image is often interpreted symbolically, yet when examined through a scientific lens, it closely mirrors how Earth itself organizes space. Continents are framed by oceans, climate zones wrap around latitudes, and circulation systems loop endlessly, redistributing energy and matter across the globe. What the storytellers captured in serpentine form is the concept of enclosure, the realization that worlds are not infinite planes, but finite systems bounded by dynamic interfaces. In Earth system science, boundaries are not static walls. They are active regions where exchange occurs. Coastlines, for example, are among the most biologically productive environments on the planet because they concentrate nutrients, sunlight, and mechanical energy from waves. Similarly, oceanic fronts, where warm and cold currents meet, generate turbulence, mixing, and life. These liminal spaces are where gradients sharpen and complexity intensifies. Jörmungandr's ring functions in much the same way. It is not merely a perimeter, it is an active margin, a living interface between the known world and the abyss beyond. By coiling around Midgard, the serpent effectively becomes a mythic representation of the continental shelf, the zone where land gives way to deep ocean, and where human activity meets planetary process. For early Scandinavian societies, this boundary was deeply tangible. Archaeological evidence shows that most settlements clustered along coasts and fjords, where fishing, trade, and navigation were possible. Inland regions were often forested, mountainous, or glacial, making maritime routes the primary arteries of connection. The edge of the sea was therefore both gateway and limit, a place of opportunity and danger, abundance and disappearance. Storm records inferred from sediment cores and coastal geomorphology indicate that North Atlantic weather systems have long been volatile, driven by interactions between polar air masses and warm ocean currents. Even today, these dynamics produce some of the most powerful cyclones on Earth. For ancient mariners, such forces were experienced not as abstract meteorology, but as immediate existential threat. Ships vanished, shorelines shifted. Entire communities could be reshaped by a single season of extreme storms. Against this backdrop, imagining a vast serpent beneath the waves was not an exercise in fantasy. It was a way of giving form to systemic unpredictability. The ocean already behaved like a living entity. It breathed through tides, lashed out through storms, and withdrew through freezing. Jörmungandr simply unified these behaviors into a single coherent presence. From a scientific standpoint, what is especially striking is how accurately this myth encodes feedback logic. When the serpent remains coiled, the world persists in relative stability. When it stirs, consequences ripple outward. This parallels how Earth's regulatory systems operate. As long as atmospheric circulation, ocean currents, and biospheric processes remain within certain thresholds, climate stays habitable. But when feedback loops intensify, through warming seas, melting ice, or altered carbon cycles, global conditions shift. The Norse expressed this sensitivity through narrative causality. The serpent's position maintains order. Its movement signals disruption. Modern climate science offers a comparable framework. Consider the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, a massive system of currents that transports heat from equatorial regions toward the North Atlantic. Changes in this circulation can alter weather patterns across entire continents. Or consider polar ice, whose reflective surface regulates planetary temperature. As ice diminishes, more solar energy is absorbed, accelerating warming. These are not localized effects. They are boundary phenomena that propagate globally. Jörmungandr's ring around Midgard operates on this same conceptual level. It embodies the idea that the world is enclosed by processes far larger than human scale, and that stability depends on their continuity. Over time, as the serpent completes its circuit, the horizon itself becomes defined by water. Coastlines harden into mental maps. The sea becomes a perimeter. Humanity occupies an island of relative predictability, surrounded by an immense circulating system that both sustains and threatens it. In this way, the myth mirrors geographic reality. Terrestrial life exists within a narrow envelope of conditions, buffered by oceans that regulate temperature, supply moisture, and absorb excess heat. This chapter, then, is not about spectacle. It is about enclosure. It is about the moment when a growing force finishes tracing the outline of a world. We pause here deliberately because this is where the documentary perspective deepens. Once a boundary forms, history begins. Migration follows edges. Trade routes hug coastlines. Cultures develop around ports. Even belief systems orient themselves toward horizons. With the serpent in place, Midgard becomes a contained system, and containment gives rise to civilization. Above the waves, villages rise along fjords. Boats move between islands. Seasonal rhythms establish themselves. Below the surface, currents continue their ancient circulation, and the great ring holds, not rigidly, not permanently, but long enough for human stories to unfold within its embrace. In the next chapter, we will move closer to that human perspective, examining how gods and people alike respond to living within a bounded world, and how awareness of the serpent's presence begins to shape ritual, navigation, and prophecy. With the great oceanic ring now in place, the human world, known in Norse cosmology as Midgard, enters a new phase, because once a boundary exists, perception changes, and when perception changes, culture follows. And this chapter is not about gods or monsters so much as it is about what happens to societies when they come to understand themselves as living inside a finite system, enclosed by forces vastly larger than their own tools, voices, or lifespans. From an anthropological perspective, coastlines are among the most powerful shapers of civilization. They concentrate resources, facilitate migration, and impose limits simultaneously. Archaeological surveys across Scandinavia reveal that by the late Neolithic and Bronze Age, human communities were already deeply oriented toward the sea. Settlements clustered along fjords and inlets. Fishing technologies diversified. Boat construction evolved rapidly. Rock art depicts ships in ceremonial procession, sometimes carrying solar symbols, sometimes animals, sometimes abstract forms whose meanings remain debated. These images are not decorative. They are environmental records, visual testimonies to a world structured by water. Living beside a cold, storm-driven ocean requires continuous attention to patterns. Tides must be anticipated, winds interpreted, seasonal changes memorized. Over generations, this produces cultures with heightened environmental literacy, societies that encode meteorological knowledge into story, ritual, and navigation practice. In such contexts, myth becomes a storage medium for ecological memory. The image of Jörmungandr circling Midgard functions precisely this way. It externalizes the lived experience of enclosure. From any Scandinavian shoreline, the horizon is dominated by water. Beyond that line lies trade, exploration, and food, but also disappearance. Boats depart and do not always return. Storms rise without warning. Ice advances and retreats across decades. The sea is both connective tissue and absolute limit. In modern geography, we understand this as the continental margin, a narrow zone where land-based ecosystems meet marine systems, where nutrient flow intensifies and biological productivity peaks. It is also where tectonic processes, sediment transport, and erosion reshape landscapes continuously. Fjords themselves are the legacy of glacial carving, deep valleys flooded by rising seas after the last ice age. Every Scandinavian harbor is therefore a geological archive, recording cycles of ice, melt, and inundation. For early inhabitants, these processes were not abstract. Shorelines shifted within living memory. Forests gave way to water. New islands emerged while others vanished. In such a dynamic environment, the idea that the world is ringed by a living boundary becomes less metaphorical and more observational. Stability feels conditional. The ground itself seems temporary. From a systems perspective, Midgard operates like a contained ecological basin. Inputs arrive from the sea: fish stocks, driftwood, trade goods, foreign ideas. Outputs depart the same way. Weather patterns generated over the North Atlantic propagate inland. Even today, Scandinavian climates are moderated by ocean currents that transport heat from lower latitudes. Without this marine influence, much of northern Europe would resemble subarctic tundra. This dependency is critical. Human life in Midgard persists only because the surrounding ocean regulates temperature, supplies protein, and connects distant communities. Jörmungandr's encirclement thus mirrors a fundamental truth of Earth system science. Terrestrial civilization is nested inside marine processes, but containment also produces psychological effects. When horizons feel closed, cultures begin to imagine what lies beyond. Cosmologies expand outward. Invisible realms populate the margins of maps. In Norse tradition, the sea does not simply mark distance, it marks transition, a threshold between the familiar and the unknowable. To cross it is to enter uncertainty. This is why maritime ritual becomes so prominent in Nordic archaeology. Offerings are found in wetlands and coastal waters. Weapons and tools are deliberately submerged. Ships are buried like bodies. These practices suggest an understanding of water as both passage and archive, a medium through which communication with unseen systems might occur. Modern science recognizes wetlands and marine sediments as some of the planet's most effective long-term storage environments, preserving organic material for millennia. Myth expresses the same intuition in spiritual language. Within Midgard, daily life adapts to this coiled horizon. Navigation follows stars and coastlines. Seasonal calendars align with fish migrations. Architecture responds to wind exposure and salt spray. Even social organization reflects maritime realities, favoring cooperation, shared risk, and collective response to environmental uncertainty. This is not incidental. Complex societies arise where coordination becomes necessary for survival. In coastal Scandinavia, storms demand communal labor. Shipbuilding requires shared expertise. Long-distance trade depends on trust networks. The presence of an enclosing oceanic system accelerates social integration. And always beneath this practical adaptation lies the awareness of something vast beneath the waves, not seen, not measured, but felt. We pause here because this chapter marks the point where myth intersects directly with lived experience. Jörmungandr is no longer just a cosmic entity. It becomes a psychological constant, an ever-present implication beneath every voyage and every shoreline. The serpent is not encountered daily, yet its presence is assumed, woven into how space itself is understood. Midgard becomes a world with edges, and edges change behavior. They create centers. They generate roots. They inspire questions about what lies beyond containment. In the next chapter, we will turn toward the gods themselves, examining how even divine figures respond to living within a bounded system, and how one in particular begins to test the limits of the serpent's hold. When a system becomes bounded, even its architects must adapt. And in Norse cosmology, the enclosure of Midgard does not simply alter human behavior. It reshapes divine strategy as well. Because once Jörmungandr completes its great circuit beneath the seas, the gods themselves come to inhabit a universe where containment replaces expansion, where power must be managed rather than merely exercised, and where every intervention carries systemic consequence. The Aesir are often portrayed as all-powerful, yet a closer reading of the myths preserved in sources like the Prose Edda reveals something far more subtle. These gods operate within constraints. They negotiate with giants. They bind forces rather than erase them. They distribute threats across domains instead of attempting absolute control. This is not the behavior of omnipotent beings. It is the behavior of managers inside a complex system. From a scientific perspective, this framing is strikingly modern. In contemporary environmental governance, large-scale forces, climate, oceans, biodiversity cannot be eliminated. They can only be regulated, buffered, or redirected. Feedback loops must be stabilized, thresholds monitored, resilience cultivated. The Norse gods facing Loki's offspring adopt precisely this approach. Fenrir is bound. Hel is assigned stewardship of death. Jörmungandr is released into the ocean. Each solution integrates risk into structure, but integration does not eliminate fear. Of all the gods, it is Thor who becomes most directly associated with the serpent. Thor is not a strategist like Odin. He is not a negotiator. He is force embodied, lightning, muscle, momentum. His domain is weather and impact. In ecological terms, Thor represents disturbance events, storms, impacts, rapid energy release. Wherever Thor appears, equilibrium is broken. This makes him the natural counterweight to Jörmungandr. Storm systems and oceans are deeply intertwined. Modern meteorology shows that hurricanes, cyclones, and polar lows draw their energy from warm surface waters. Atmospheric pressure gradients feed on oceanic heat content. Thunderstorms redistribute moisture across continents. Thor's mythic identity as a sky-born force mirrors this physical reality. He is the atmosphere's answer to the sea. As Jörmungandr settles into its planetary circuit, Thor begins to test its limits, not through abstract planning, but through confrontation. The myths record multiple encounters between them, each one less a personal rivalry and more an expression of system-level tension. Atmosphere versus ocean, impact versus circulation, disruption versus containment. The gods understand something critical at this stage. Jörmungandr cannot be destroyed without destabilizing the world it surrounds. This is why its punishment is exile, not execution. The serpent has become structurally embedded in Midgard's boundary conditions. Remove it, and the system collapses. This mirrors a core principle in modern Earth system science. Certain components, polar ice, rainforests, ocean currents, are so deeply integrated into planetary regulation that abrupt removal would trigger cascading failures. These are called tipping elements. Once altered beyond recovery, they can shift the entire climate regime. Jörmungandr functions as a mythic tipping element. The gods bind it indirectly by leaving it where it is, and yet they remain vigilant. In Asgard, the divine realm, councils are held, omens are watched. The future is treated not as fixed destiny, but as probability space. Norse cosmology is often misunderstood as fatalistic, yet the gods continuously act to delay or reshape outcomes. Ragnarok is foreseen but not passively awaited. Every binding, every exile, every confrontation represents an attempt to manage risk. This is governance under uncertainty. Thor's vigilance becomes symbolic of this posture. He patrols boundaries. He responds to disturbances. He tests structural integrity through force. In modern terms, he behaves like an extreme stressor, revealing weaknesses in systems by pushing them to their limits. Storms expose fragile infrastructure. Floods reveal planning failures. Thor's clashes with the serpent perform the same diagnostic role. For humans in Midgard, these divine tensions translate into observable phenomena: violent storms, dangerous seas, sudden weather shifts. Thunder over the North Atlantic is not merely sound, it is interpreted as Thor in motion. Rough waters are not just waves, they are Jörmungandr adjusting its coils. Myth becomes explanatory framework for coupled ocean-atmosphere dynamics. And beneath this symbolic layer lies a deeper insight. Stability requires constant effort. Boundaries must be maintained. Forces must be balanced. No system, once established, remains self-sustaining without active regulation. We pause here because this chapter reveals something essential about the Norse worldview. Their gods are not detached overseers. They are participants in a living system, subject to its constraints, shaped by its feedback, and forced to make trade-offs between immediate action and long-term stability. Jörmungandr is no longer merely a distant presence beneath the waves. It is now a strategic concern, a monitored variable, a boundary condition that even gods must respect. In the next chapter, we will follow Thor into one of his earliest direct encounters with the serpent, examining how a single fishing expedition becomes a case study in planetary scale tension, and how close the world comes, even then, to catastrophic imbalance. The encounter that follows is often remembered as spectacle: a god in a boat, a serpent in the deep. But when examined through a documentary lens, it becomes something far more instructive. A controlled experiment at planetary scale, a moment when atmosphere meets ocean directly, when force confronts circulation, and when the stability of Midgard is briefly placed under measurable stress. Because this is not merely a mythic fishing trip, it is a probe into the limits of containment. The episode is preserved in several sources, most notably the prose Edda, and it centers on Thor, who travels out to sea with the giant Hymir, a figure whose role is often overlooked but whose presence is essential, because Hymir represents local knowledge, the practical experience of navigating dangerous waters, while Thor embodies applied force, the sudden release of energy that tests system integrity. From the outset, the narrative emphasizes distance. Thor demands to row far beyond customary fishing grounds, out past the zones where humans normally operate, into deeper, colder waters where the continental shelf begins to fall away and the abyss asserts itself. In modern oceanography, this transition marks a dramatic change in conditions. Light drops rapidly, pressure increases, and biological communities shift from coastal productivity to sparse deep-sea survival. It is here, in this liminal band, that the serpent is said to dwell. Thor prepares his bait using the severed head of an ox, an agricultural symbol repurposed for oceanic confrontation. This detail is not incidental. It visually links terrestrial biomass to marine predation, echoing a real ecological process in which nutrients generated on land eventually enter the sea through rivers and runoff, feeding coastal food webs. The ox head becomes a proxy for human civilization itself, lowered into depths that usually remain untouched. When Thor casts his line, the action carries layered meaning. On one level, it is simply fishing. On another, it represents the insertion of atmospheric force into oceanic circulation, a vertical intrusion into a horizontal system. In physical terms, it is a disturbance introduced into a stable gradient, and the response is immediate. The myths describe Jörmungandr rising from the depths, jaws opening around the bait, eyes breaking the surface as storms gather overhead. Documentary science recognizes this pattern well. When deep systems are perturbed, energy redistributes. Pressure changes propagate. Surface conditions react. Modern analogs include undersea earthquakes triggering tsunamis, or shifts in deep currents altering surface climate over time. Here, the disturbance is localized, but the implication is planetary. Thor braces himself in the boat, planting his feet through the hull, anchoring directly into the structure of the vessel, a symbolic detail that signals total commitment of force. He begins to haul upward, drawing the serpent toward the surface. At this moment, myth and physics converge. Lifting a massive body through water requires overcoming buoyancy, drag, and inertia. It is not a simple act of strength. It is a battle against the properties of the medium itself. In environmental terms, Thor is attempting to extract a boundary condition from its context. This is precisely what makes the moment dangerous, because Jörmungandr is no longer just an organism. It is integrated into oceanic systems. Its body traces currents. Its presence defines margins. To pull it upward is to deform the interface between Midgard and the abyss. The gods understand this intuitively, even if the language of feedback loops and tipping points lies centuries in the future. As Thor draws the serpent closer, the sea darkens. The sky responds. Lightning forms. Wind rises. These are not decorative flourishes. They reflect coupled ocean-atmosphere dynamics. Rapid changes in surface temperature or pressure can intensify storms. In modern meteorology, we see this when warm waters fuel cyclones or when cold fronts trigger violent convection. The myth compresses these interactions into a single dramatic tableau. For a brief interval, Thor and Jörmungandr lock eyes. This is not merely confrontation. It is recognition between two regulatory forces. One governs sky and impact. The other governs sea and circulation. Each is capable of destabilizing the system the other depends upon. Thor raises his hammer, preparing to strike. The implication is clear. If he delivers the blow, the serpent may die, but so too may the boundary it maintains. This is the paradox of intervention in complex systems. Removing a destabilizing element can sometimes produce greater instability than leaving it in place. At this critical threshold, Hymir intervenes. In some versions of the myth, the giant cuts the fishing line. In others, fear causes him to lose control. Either way, the result is the same. The connection is severed and Jörmungandr falls back into the deep, vanishing beneath the waves as pressure and darkness reclaim it. From a scientific standpoint, this moment represents aborted extraction. The system recoils into its prior configuration. The disturbance dissipates. Surface conditions gradually normalize. Thor's attempt fails, but failure here is preservation. The serpent returns to its coil. The ocean resumes its circulation. The horizon stabilizes, and Midgard continues. We pause here because this chapter demonstrates something essential about Norse cosmology. Even gods encounter limits. Thor's strength is immense, yet it proves insufficient to safely remove a system-integrated force. This mirrors a sobering lesson from modern environmental science. Human technology is powerful, but when applied without regard for systemic coupling, it can amplify risk rather than resolve it. Deep-sea mining, large-scale geoengineering, and rapid ecosystem alteration all carry similar dangers. Intervening in boundary processes demands humility because consequences rarely remain localized. The fishing expedition teaches restraint. It reveals that some entities, once embedded into planetary function, cannot be simply pulled free. Jörmungandr survives, not because it is invincible, but because its existence has become structural. In the next chapter, we will move beyond this single encounter and examine how stories of giants, fishermen, and omens spread through human communities, how memory of this near catastrophe enters cultural tradition, and how prophecy begins to form around the serpent's eventual return to the surface. After the failed confrontation at sea, the world does not immediately change. There is no collapse of coastlines, no sudden darkening of skies, no visible scar left on the horizon. Instead, what spreads first is memory. In human systems, memory is how disturbances persist after physical motion has ceased. Events become stories. Stories become warnings. Warnings become ritual. And in Norse culture, the near emergence of Jörmungandr enters collective awareness not as data, but as prophecy. From an anthropological perspective, this transition is crucial. Societies do not respond only to what happens. They respond to what they believe might happen. Risk perception shapes behavior long before measurable impacts arrive. In coastal Scandinavia, where survival already depended on interpreting subtle environmental signals, this encounter becomes a reference point, a narrative marker embedded into oral tradition, repeated around hearths, encoded in verse, and eventually carved into stone. Archaeologists have long noted the prevalence of serpentine motifs on Viking Age runestones and metalwork. These designs are not merely decorative. They function as symbolic containers, wrapping names, deeds, and memorial inscriptions in looping bodies that echo the world serpent itself. From a documentary standpoint, this is cultural feedback. The image of enclosure migrates from cosmology into material culture, reinforcing the idea that human lives unfold inside larger, circling forces. The fishing episode also introduces a second layer of interpretation: scale mismatch. Thor's attempt demonstrates that even immense localized power struggles against distributed systems. The serpent does not resist with muscle alone. It resists through integration. Its mass is spread across currents, trenches, and continental margins. Pulling on one point tugs at an entire network. Modern systems science recognizes this pattern clearly. Networks with high connectivity absorb shocks by redistributing stress. Remove one node and load transfers elsewhere. In ecological terms, this is resilience. In mythic terms, it is inevitability. Human storytellers intuitively grasp this. As the tale spreads, emphasis shifts away from Thor's strength and toward the impossibility of extracting the serpent without unraveling the sea itself. Over generations, this becomes formalized as destiny, not passive fatalism, but recognition of structural constraint. This is where prophecy enters. Norse prophecy is not prediction in the modern sense. It does not offer timelines or probabilities. Instead, it outlines trajectories. It identifies which interactions are unsustainable, which forces are accumulating tension, and where release will eventually occur. From a scientific lens, prophecy behaves like systems modeling. It extrapolates future states from present dynamics. Seeresses, known as Verler, played a central role in this process. They were cultural interpreters of pattern, reading signs in weather, animal behavior, dreams, and ritual outcomes. Their authority did not come from supernatural spectacle alone, but from long familiarity with environmental rhythms. In societies without written meteorology or climate records, such figures acted as living databases, preserving generational knowledge of cycles and anomalies. Within this framework, Jörmungandr becomes a boundary indicator. As long as the serpent remains coiled, the system persists. When it shifts, transition begins. This conditional stability mirrors how modern scientists speak about tipping points. Ice sheets remain intact until warming crosses a threshold. Forests persist until drought and fire exceed recovery capacity. Ocean circulation continues until freshwater input alters density gradients. The Norse expressed this same logic through narrative. Ragnarok does not arrive randomly. It follows specific structural failures. The fishing encounter is remembered as one such precursor. It is not the end. It is an early signal. Among coastal communities, this memory influences behavior in subtle ways. Ritual offerings increase. Storms are interpreted more urgently. Unusual tides attract attention. Even fishing practices carry symbolic weight. Lowering bait into deep water becomes an echo of Thor's act, a reminder that beneath every voyage lies something immeasurable. Giants, too, take on new narrative significance. Figures like Hymir are no longer just antagonists. They represent intermediary knowledge, beings who understand the sea's dangers through experience rather than force. In modern terms, Hymir embodies local ecological expertise. He knows where boats can go safely. He recognizes when conditions exceed tolerance. His decision to cut the line is not cowardice. It is risk management. This distinction matters. Large systems rarely fail because of ignorance alone. They fail when warning signals are ignored. Hymir acts at the moment when extraction threatens collapse. He restores separation between atmosphere and abyss. He allows the serpent to return to equilibrium. From a documentary perspective, this reframes the scene entirely. The giant becomes an early practitioner of precautionary principle. When consequences are uncertain and potentially catastrophic, restraint becomes rational. As generations pass, this lesson becomes embedded in cultural memory. Stories emphasize thresholds. Poems speak of rising seas and shaking ground. Serpent imagery accompanies memorials. The horizon is no longer just distance, it is expectation. We pause here because this chapter marks the emergence of foresight. The world has not ended, but it has learned something about itself. Humans now inhabit Midgard with awareness of fragility. The gods monitor omens more closely. The serpent resumes its quiet circulation beneath the waves. And across Scandinavia, along fjords and islands, people continue their daily lives while carrying an inherited understanding. That stability is conditional, that boundaries are alive, and that certain forces, once integrated into planetary systems, will someday demand reckoning. In the next chapter, we will follow how this awareness spreads across cultures and coastlines, how similar serpent motifs appear far beyond the Norse world, and what comparative mythology reveals about humanity's shared intuition of oceans, cycles, and cosmic return. By the time Norse storytellers had begun to speak of a world-ringed ocean serpent, similar images were already echoing across distant continents, separated by oceans yet bound by a shared relationship with water, horizon, and cyclic time. And for documentary science, this convergence matters, because when cultures with no contact arrive at comparable symbols, the explanation rarely lies in coincidence alone. It lies in common environmental experience. In the universal constraints imposed by planetary systems, and in the way human cognition translates those constraints into narrative form. In Scandinavia, that boundary presence is Jörmungandr, but elsewhere it appears under different names and shapes. In ancient India as Shesha, whose coils support the universe. In Mesoamerica as Quetzalcoatl, linking sky and earth. And in Mesopotamian tradition as Tiamat, a primordial sea being from which creation itself emerges. These figures differ in temperament and narrative outcome, yet structurally they occupy the same role. They are boundary entities, positioned at interfaces between order and chaos, land and water, stability and transformation. Comparative mythology has long noted this pattern, but only recently have researchers begun to connect it systematically with Earth system dynamics. Human civilizations arose almost exclusively along coastlines and river systems. The earliest cities clustered near deltas. Trade followed currents. Agriculture depended on seasonal flooding. In every case, prosperity emerged at environmental margins, places where fresh water met salt, where sediment accumulated, where nutrient exchange intensified. These are the same liminal zones that modern ecology identifies as hotspots of productivity and vulnerability. Serpents become the natural metaphor for such spaces. Their bodies are elongated like rivers. Their movement resembles currents. Their ability to shed skin mirrors seasonal renewal. Their coiling suggests cycles, return, feedback. When cultures attempt to visualize planetary scale circulation, without satellites, without models, they turn to the most fluid creature they know. From a scientific standpoint, this convergence is not symbolic abstraction. It is experiential encoding. Humans everywhere learned that water does not simply sit in place. It moves. It connects distant regions. It carries nutrients, storms, and life. The idea that a single continuous presence might bind the edges of the world is therefore not speculative. It is intuitive. Modern oceanography confirms this intuition with precision. Global circulation links polar seas to equatorial basins. Heat absorbed near the tropics is released at higher latitudes. Carbon cycles through plankton, sediments, and atmosphere. What happens in one ocean basin propagates elsewhere over time. The planet behaves as an integrated hydrological organism. Jörmungandr's ring around Midgard expresses exactly this integration. What changes across cultures is emphasis. In Norse tradition, the serpent is restrained but dangerous. In Hindu cosmology, Shesha is stabilizing, sustaining Vishnu and the cosmos itself. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl becomes civilizing force, associated with wind, learning, and rebirth. In Mesopotamia, Tiamat embodies primordial chaos, defeated to establish order. Each reflects local environmental pressures: glacial seas in the north, monsoon cycles in South Asia, seasonal drought and rain in Central America, river-fed floodplains in the Fertile Crescent. Yet beneath these differences lies the same structural insight. Worlds persist because boundaries circulate energy. This realization becomes especially clear when viewed through the lens of modern climate science. The ocean absorbs more than 90% of excess heat generated by greenhouse forcing. Without this buffering capacity, atmospheric temperatures would rise far more rapidly. Marine phytoplankton generate a significant fraction of Earth's oxygen. Coastal wetlands store carbon. Ice-covered seas regulate planetary albedo. These processes are not peripheral, they are foundational. In myth, these functions are unified into serpent form. The serpent is not merely a monster. It is the living diagram of planetary regulation. As Norse traders and explorers moved across the North Atlantic, they carried this imagery with them. Serpent carvings appear on ship prows, shields, and memorial stones. These were not decorative alone. They were protective symbols, acknowledgments that voyages occurred within a larger circulatory system. To sail was to enter the serpent's domain. To return was to be released from its coils. Anthropologists studying maritime cultures observe similar patterns worldwide. Sailors personify currents. Fishermen speak of moods in the sea. Island societies develop rituals to appease storms. These practices emerge not from superstition, but from adaptive respect for systems beyond direct control. Over centuries, such respect crystallizes into cosmology, and cosmology becomes infrastructure for meaning. We pause here because Chapter 10 marks a widening of perspective. Jörmungandr is no longer only Norse. It becomes one expression of a global human attempt to understand oceanic enclosure, cyclic return, and boundary-driven stability. The serpent archetype reveals itself as a shared language for planetary process. Different names, different stories, same underlying system. In the chapters ahead, we will narrow our focus again, returning to the North Atlantic world to examine how this serpent-centered understanding shapes psychology, ethics, and eventually eschatology. How awareness of cyclical boundaries gives rise to ideas of eternal return, collapse, and renewal. Because once humans recognize that their world is enclosed by living systems, a new question inevitably arises. What happens when those systems change? Once a culture accepts that its world is enclosed by circulating forces, attention inevitably turns inward, toward meaning, perception, and continuity. Because boundaries do not merely shape geography, they reshape psychology. And in the Norse imagination, the presence of Jörmungandr beneath the waves gradually transforms the ocean from a physical environment into a repository of memory. A vast moving archive in which past events are never fully erased, only redistributed. Modern oceanography confirms something remarkably similar. Water masses retain chemical signatures for centuries. Temperature anomalies propagate slowly through deep currents. Sediments accumulate layer by layer, preserving records of storms, volcanic eruptions, and biological change. Ice cores extracted from polar regions reveal atmospheric composition stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. From a scientific standpoint, the ocean is not just a medium, it is a memory system, storing traces of planetary history in salinity gradients, isotopic ratios, and fossilized microorganisms. Norse cosmology anticipates this idea through story. The serpent does not simply surround Midgard, it remembers it. Every current that passes along its body carries fragments of distant shores. Every storm that disturbs its coils leaves an imprint that travels onward. This is why the sea, in Nordic tradition, becomes associated not only with danger but with inheritance. What enters the water does not vanish. It returns, sometimes altered, sometimes delayed, sometimes magnified. Anthropologists studying maritime societies consistently observe this pattern. Oceans are treated as communicative systems. Offerings placed in water are believed to reach unseen realms. Shipwrecks become sacred sites. Bones recovered from tides are interpreted as messages. These practices reflect a deep intuitive grasp of circulation. People understand that the sea connects rather than isolates. In scientific language, this connectivity is expressed through global circulation models. Surface waters mix with deeper layers. Nutrients cycle between plankton and sediment. Carbon moves from atmosphere to ocean to lithosphere. Nothing remains static. Every molecule participates in slow planetary exchange. Jörmungandr embodies this exchange. Its endless body becomes a mythic representation of continuity, a living reminder that the world does not progress in straight lines but in loops. This looping logic shapes Norse concepts of time itself. Unlike linear traditions that move toward permanent resolution, Norse cosmology emphasizes recurrence. Creation leads to destruction. Destruction leads to renewal. Even the gods exist within this cycle. This is not nihilism. It is systems thinking expressed through narrative. Stability is temporary. Transformation is inevitable. What matters is how transitions unfold. Human psychology adapts accordingly. Living beside cold, unpredictable seas produces cultures that value resilience over permanence, preparedness over certainty. Archaeological evidence shows repeated rebuilding of coastal settlements after flooding or erosion. Rather than abandoning these zones entirely, communities returned, adjusting architecture, modifying harbors, learning new patterns. This behavior mirrors adaptive management strategies used today in climate-vulnerable regions. Retreat where necessary, reinforce where possible, and remain flexible. The serpent's presence reinforces this mindset. If the boundary itself is alive, then change is not an anomaly. It is the default state. In this context, prophecy becomes less about predicting specific events and more about recognizing trajectories. Seeresses do not announce dates, they describe processes. Ice will melt. Seas will rise. Storms will intensify. The serpent will stir. These statements function like early environmental forecasts, framed in mythic language but grounded in observation of long-term patterns. Even Thor's failed fishing expedition, recorded in the Prose Edda, acquires new meaning here. It becomes a data point, a remembered perturbation that did not yet trigger collapse but demonstrated proximity to threshold. In modern risk analysis, such near misses are studied carefully. They reveal system sensitivity. They inform future preparedness. Norse culture internalizes this lesson. Songs and carvings preserve the moment. Children grow up hearing that the serpent nearly rose. Fishermen repeat the tale before voyages. The story becomes part of environmental literacy, teaching restraint, respect, and attentiveness to subtle change. From a documentary perspective, this chapter reveals the ocean not merely as setting, but as educator. It teaches through cycles, through return, through delayed consequence. The sea absorbs impacts, redistributes them, and eventually releases them elsewhere. This delayed feedback is one of the most challenging aspects of modern climate science. Emissions released today will affect temperatures decades from now. Ice lost now will influence sea level centuries later. Actions propagate through time. Jörmungandr's endless body visualizes this delay. Pull on one segment, and movement travels around the world before returning. We pause here because Chapter 11 marks a shift from external systems to internal awareness. The serpent no longer functions only as boundary or threat. It becomes mnemonic infrastructure, a way for human societies to conceptualize deep time, delayed response, and cyclical return. Midgard continues its daily rhythms. Boats still leave harbor. Storms still arrive without warning. But beneath these ordinary patterns lies an expanded understanding that the ocean remembers, that boundaries circulate consequence, and that nothing placed into the world ever truly disappears. In the next chapter, We will explore how this realization shapes identity itself, how living inside a looping system alters concepts of self, responsibility, and collective fate, and how the serpent begins to move from external presence into internal metaphor. By now, the serpent has crossed a threshold. It no longer lives only beneath the waves. It has entered the interior world. Because once a society accepts that its environment operates through loops, feedback, and delayed consequence, those same patterns begin to shape identity itself. And in Norse culture, the presence of Jörmungandr gradually migrates from cosmology into psychology, from external boundary into internal metaphor, becoming a way to think about responsibility, restraint, and the long reach of action across time. Modern cognitive science tells us that humans understand complex systems through embodied imagery. We grasp abstraction by mapping it onto physical experience. Cycles become circles, return becomes coiling, consequence becomes something that comes back around. The Norse did exactly this. They took the largest feedback system they knew, the ocean, and gave it a body. The result was not fear alone, it was perspective. To live in Midgard was to live inside a loop. And to live inside a loop meant that every action mattered beyond its immediate outcome. Anthropologists studying northern maritime cultures have long observed an ethic of moderation embedded in daily practice. Fishing quotas emerged organically long before formal management. Certain breeding seasons were respected. Sacred groves and wetlands were left untouched. These behaviors were not codified through legislation. They were reinforced through story, taboo, and shared memory. The serpent played a central role in this moral ecology. If the boundary itself was alive, then excess risked disturbance. This is not mysticism. It is early systems awareness. In modern terms, this maps closely onto sustainability thinking. Actions taken in one domain propagate through others. Overharvesting fish alters predator populations. Deforestation affects runoff and coastal sedimentation. Burning fuel changes atmospheric chemistry, which in turn alters ocean temperature. The Norse expressed this interconnectedness through mythic causality. Anger the sea and storms answer, disrupt the serpent and the world responds. The psychological effect of this framing is subtle but profound. Individuals come to see themselves not as isolated agents but as nodes in a circulating whole. Responsibility extends outward. Fate becomes collective. Even the gods operate under this constraint. This is why Norse heroes rarely seek permanent victory. They seek balance. They delay collapse. They accept that endings are part of cycles rather than failures of will. From a documentary perspective, this worldview is strikingly aligned with resilience theory. Systems persist not by avoiding disturbance, but by absorbing it, adapting, and reorganizing. Collapse is not always catastrophic. It can be transitional. Forests burn and regrow. Glaciers retreat and advance. Civilizations rise, fragment, and reassemble. The serpent encodes this logic. It does not promise safety. It promises continuity. Within this framework, even death acquires different meaning. The realm of hell is not framed as eternal punishment but as redistribution. Bodies return to soil, nutrients cycle, memory persists through descendants and story. The loop closes. Children grow up hearing that the world will end, yes, but also that it will begin again. Ragnarok is not annihilation, it is reset. Modern ecology uses similar language when describing mass extinction events followed by adaptive radiation. Loss creates space. Space invites emergence. The Norse did not possess fossil records or isotope analysis, but they lived amid landscapes shaped by ice ages and sea level rise. They saw forests advance over old shorelines. They watched marine terraces emerge above present tides. They inherited oral histories of colder centuries and warmer ones. Their cosmology reflects this deep familiarity with change. Jörmungandr becomes the narrative anchor for that familiarity. It holds the memory of previous worlds. It carries the tension of the present one. It anticipates the transformation of the next. Psychologically, this produces a culture comfortable with impermanence. Homes are built knowing storms may take them. Voyages are undertaken knowing return is uncertain. Identity is grounded not in permanence, but in participation, being part of something that continues even when individuals do not. This perspective differs sharply from traditions that emphasize linear progress or final resolution. Here, meaning arises from placement within cycles rather than movement toward endpoints, and this has ethical consequences. If actions return, then exploitation becomes self-harm. If boundaries are alive, then respect becomes practical. If collapse leads to renewal, then despair loses its finality. The serpent teaches patience. It teaches scale. It teaches that outcomes may arrive long after causes. We pause here because chapter 12 marks the inward turn. The world serpent has become more than an environmental force or mythic entity. It has become a cognitive framework, a way for humans to understand complexity, delayed feedback, and collective fate. Midgard now lives not only within the serpent's coils, but within its logic. In the next chapter, we will step back outward again, examining how this internalized understanding leaves physical traces in landscape and artifact, how stones, ships, and shorelines preserve evidence of a worldview shaped by cycles, boundaries, and return. When a worldview settles deeply enough into collective consciousness, it does not remain confined to story. It imprints itself onto landscape, artifact, and habit. And by the time Norse culture fully internalizes the presence of Jörmungandr, the serpent's logic begins to appear everywhere. In carved stone, in ship design, in burial practice, and even in how coastlines themselves are interpreted. Because systems thinking, once adopted, inevitably becomes material. Archaeologists studying Viking Age Scandinavia often remark on the dominance of looping forms. Runestones are framed by interlaced serpents. Memorial inscriptions travel along coiled bodies. Ship prows terminate in dragon-serpent hybrids. These are not random stylistic choices. They encode continuity. They turn linear text into circular motion. They force the reader's eye to follow curves rather than straight lines, reinforcing the idea that meaning itself is something that returns. From a documentary perspective, this matters. Material culture is frozen behavior. It captures how people organized space, time, and memory. On rune stones scattered across Sweden and Denmark, names of the dead are often enclosed within serpentine borders. The deceased are not separated from the living world, they are wrapped into it. The stone becomes a microcosm of Midgard, bounded by a looping creature that echoes the planetary ring. Death here is not departure, it is reintegration. Ship burials extend this logic into motion. Vessels are interred with tools, weapons, and animals, as if preparing the departed for continued circulation. In scientific terms, this resembles nutrient cycling rituals observed in many traditional societies, where bodies are returned to environments believed to redistribute essence. The Norse express it through maritime metaphor. The soul voyages onward through the same oceanic system that sustains the living. Even architecture participates. Coastal settlements align with fjords and inlets rather than imposing rigid grids. Buildings follow terrain. Harbors adapt to tides. This adaptive layout mirrors what modern planners call landscape responsive design, an approach that works with environmental gradients instead of resisting them. The serpent's influence is subtle but pervasive. Everything bends rather than breaks. Geology reinforces this worldview. Scandinavian coastlines are in constant motion, still rebounding from the weight of Ice Age glaciers. In some regions, land rises several millimeters per year, slowly exposing new shorelines while older ones retreat inland. Raised beaches, fossilized shells far from present tides, and layered sediments tell a story of repeated advance and withdrawal. These features are not ancient curiosities. They are visible within human timescales. To people living among such shifting margins, permanence is an illusion. The land itself participates in cycles. Modern Earth science describes this process as isostatic rebound and post-glacial adjustment, but Norse culture did not need equations to recognize what was happening. They saw forests advancing where water once stood. They watched harbors become shallow over generations. Their myths absorbed these observations, transforming geological motion into narrative. The serpent in this context becomes a geological metaphor as much as a biological one. Its slow coiling mirrors tectonic patience. Its return echoes sea level oscillation. Its eventual rising anticipates moments when accumulated stress finally releases. Artifacts also preserve evidence of this anticipation. Some rune stones depict serpents with open jaws. Others show them biting their tails. The difference is meaningful. Closed loops signify stability. Open mouths imply transition. Scholars debate whether these variations represent stylistic evolution or intentional symbolism, but from a systems perspective, they reflect awareness of phase change, of moments when cycles tighten or loosen. Boats, too, tell a story. Longships are built for flexibility. Their shallow drafts allow navigation of rivers and open seas alike. Their hulls flex in waves rather than resisting them rigidly. This engineering philosophy mirrors ecological resilience. Survive by adapting shape to force. Even here, the serpent's lesson is present: bend, flow, return. The Norse did not write treatises on sustainability or resilience theory. They carved it, they sailed it, they buried their dead within it, and all of it unfolded beneath the silent assumption that the world was ringed by a living boundary. This chapter reveals something critical. Cosmology becomes infrastructure. Belief shapes design. Story informs engineering. The idea of a coiled world produces a culture comfortable with curvature, repetition, and adaptation. Straight lines are rare. Spirals dominate. From a modern documentary standpoint, this convergence of myth and material practice demonstrates how deeply environmental understanding can penetrate society without ever becoming formal science. Observation becomes symbol. Symbol becomes habit. Habit becomes built environment. And through it all, the serpent remains implied, not always named, not always depicted, but always present in how space is organized and how memory is preserved. We pause here because chapter 13 shows us that Jörmungandr is no longer confined to ocean or sky. It has entered stone and timber. It lives in the curves of ships and the loops of inscriptions. It shapes how the dead are remembered and how the living move across water. The world is not just enclosed by the serpent, it is constructed in its image. In the next chapter, we will turn toward the largest scale once more, exploring how these accumulated signs, geological, cultural, and psychological, begin to align toward a single expectation: that cycles do not merely repeat quietly but eventually culminate in transformation. That boundaries, after long patience, do not simply hold, they release. By this stage in the documentary, the pattern has become unmistakable. Environment shapes myth, myth shapes behavior, and behavior feeds back into environment. And within this recursive loop, the presence of Jörmungandr begins to function less as a creature and more as a temporal engine. A way of understanding not just where the world ends, but how it moves through time. Because once boundaries are accepted as living systems, history itself becomes cyclical rather than linear. And every generation learns to read change not as anomaly, but as recurrence. In Norse cosmology, time does not flow toward a final resting point. It turns. This is not philosophical abstraction. It emerges directly from environmental observation. Glaciers advance and retreat. Sea levels rise and fall. Forests migrate across centuries. Storm intensity varies across decades. Even daylight itself oscillates dramatically at northern latitudes, where summer brings near continuous sun and winter delivers long, dark nights. To inhabit such landscapes is to experience rhythm at planetary scale. Modern paleoclimatology confirms what Norse tradition encoded through story. Earth operates through cycles. Ice ages repeat. Ocean circulation reorganizes. Solar variability leaves fingerprints in tree rings and ice cores. Volcanic episodes punctuate long periods of relative calm. None of this proceeds in straight lines. The Norse expressed this reality through mythic recurrence. Worlds emerge, worlds decline, worlds begin again. Jörmungandr's endless body biting its own tail becomes the most concise visual summary of this principle ever devised. It is feedback made flesh. It is return without endpoint. From a scientific standpoint, this mirrors how complex systems behave near equilibrium. They oscillate. They overshoot and correct. They accumulate stress and release it. Earth's climate history is a record of such oscillations. Warm periods followed by cooling, stability punctuated by abrupt shifts. Even the carbon cycle moves in loops, passing through atmosphere, biosphere, ocean, and rock before returning. What makes the Norse perspective distinctive is that it does not imagine escape from this pattern. There is no promised permanence beyond the cycle. Instead, meaning arises from participation within it. This becomes especially clear when we examine how celestial phenomena were interpreted. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia include solar disks, spiral engravings, and ship motifs associated with the sun's journey. These artifacts reveal a worldview in which cosmic motion was inseparable from terrestrial fate. The sky itself was understood as part of the same circulating system as sea and land. Auroras shimmering over winter coasts were not random lights. They were signs of energy exchange between Earth and space. Sudden cold snaps or unusual storms were not isolated events. They were interpreted as adjustments within a living whole. Today, space weather scientists describe geomagnetic storms in precisely these terms: bursts of solar energy interacting with Earth's magnetic field. Again, myth anticipates model. Within this framework, even the gods are subject to cycle. Odin seeks knowledge not to escape fate, but to navigate it. Thor confronts disturbance not to eliminate it, but to delay collapse. And Jörmungandr maintains its coil not to preserve the present forever, but to hold the system together until accumulated tensions demand transformation. This is where the idea of eternal return enters Norse thought. Unlike traditions that envision history as a march toward transcendence, Norse cosmology treats repetition as fundamental. After destruction comes renewal. After winter comes summer. After submergence comes emergence. This is not optimism or pessimism. It is pattern recognition. Modern ecology offers a direct parallel. Forests experience succession. After fire, pioneer species colonize. Over time, complexity returns. Coral reefs recover after bleaching if conditions stabilize. Even mass extinction events, devastating as they are, have historically been followed by bursts of diversification. Life reorganizes itself. The serpent encodes this resilience. It does not guarantee survival of any particular form. It guarantees continuity of process. Human societies living within this worldview develop a distinctive relationship with loss. Homes are rebuilt. Ships are replaced. Coastlines shift. Memory persists through story rather than structure. What matters is not preservation of every artifact, but maintenance of connection across generations. From a documentary perspective, This is perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Norse cosmology. It normalizes transformation. It teaches that stability is temporary, that boundaries hold only until they must change, and that collapse, when it comes, is not final silence but transition. Jörmungandr's coil, therefore, is not a prison. It is a hinge, a mechanism that allows worlds to turn. We pause here because chapter 14 brings us to the edge of inevitability. The cycles have been established. The feedbacks are in place. Cultural memory has absorbed the lesson of return. Geological and climatic processes continue their slow accumulation of stress. The serpent remains coiled, but coiled systems store energy, and eventually stored energy seeks release. In the next chapter, we will examine how Norse tradition begins to identify early indicators of that release. Subtle changes in weather, shifting seas, social unrest, and prophetic imagery that signal the approach of systemic transition. Because long before Ragnarök arrives in fire and flood, it first appears as pattern. Long before collapse announces itself through spectacle, it arrives quietly, through gradients and anomalies, through patterns that only become obvious in retrospect. And in Norse tradition, these early indicators are not treated as random misfortune, but as system signals, subtle messages carried by weather, sea, and social rhythm. Because once a culture understands that its world operates through cycles, it also learns to watch for deviations. And by this stage in the unfolding narrative, the presence of Jörmungandr has sharpened collective attention to exactly such change. Modern Earth science calls these leading indicators. They include shifts in storm frequency, altered migration routes, unusual ice behavior, and persistent temperature anomalies. Long before glaciers retreat dramatically or oceans rise visibly, these quieter precursors appear. Earlier spring melt, later autumn freeze, subtle changes in salinity that ripple through fisheries. Contemporary climatology relies on these signals to anticipate tipping points. Norse cosmology embeds the same logic in story. The myths preserved in sources such as the Prose Edda describe a world that begins to feel wrong before Ragnarök itself. Winters lengthen, harvests falter, bonds between communities fray. These are not isolated catastrophes. They are cascading stresses across interconnected systems, environmental, economic, and social, mirroring what modern resilience theory identifies as coupled failure. In coastal Scandinavia, such signals would have been tangible. Fishing yields fluctuate with ocean temperature and plankton cycles. Ice conditions determine whether harbors remain accessible. Storm tracks govern trade and travel. A sequence of poor seasons can destabilize entire regions. Archaeological layers show periods of abandonment followed by resettlement, indicating oscillations between prosperity and contraction long before written history. Norse tradition frames these oscillations as the serpent's first movements, not dramatic thrashing, small adjustments, a tightening of coils, a change in current. From a scientific standpoint, this is precisely how large systems behave near transition. Before abrupt change, variability increases. Extremes become more frequent. Recovery slows after disturbance. Ecologists call this critical slowing down. It is a measurable precursor to regime shift. The Norse did not have statistical models, but they had memory. They noticed when storms arrived out of season. They noticed when familiar species failed to return. They noticed when ice behaved unpredictably. These observations fed into prophecy not as mysticism, but as pattern recognition passed through generations. Social dynamics also begin to reflect environmental pressure. Competition intensifies. Alliances strain. Violence rises. Anthropologists studying climate variability across history consistently find correlations between prolonged environmental stress and social fragmentation. Scarcity amplifies conflict. Migration increases. Trust erodes. Norse myth records this as the breakdown of kinship and oath, families turning against families, communities losing cohesion. Again, this is not arbitrary symbolism. It mirrors documented human responses to sustained ecological uncertainty. Within this context, Jörmungandr becomes less a distant boundary and more an active variable. The serpent's subtle stirring is invoked to explain why familiar patterns no longer hold. The world is not ending yet, but it is reorganizing. For seeresses and elders, this period is marked by heightened attention to omens, birds flying inland, unusual wave behavior, sudden temperature shifts. Even today, coastal communities often detect change through sensory experience long before instruments confirm it. Fishers notice altered currents. Farmers sense different soil moisture. These embodied observations are powerful early warning systems. The Norse integrated such signals into ritual and narrative. Offerings increase. Councils convene. Travel decisions become more cautious. Preparation replaces confidence. The serpent's presence sharpens awareness that actions taken now may echo later. Thor's earlier encounter at sea is remembered during this time as precedent. The line was cut. The serpent returned to depth. Stability resumed temporarily. But the lesson endures. Extraction without understanding risks collapse. Intervention must be measured. Force must be paired with foresight. From a documentary perspective, Chapter 15 represents the prelude to transition, the phase where data accumulates but meaning remains contested. Some interpret anomalies as temporary fluctuation. Others sense deeper shift. This tension between normalization and warning is familiar to modern audiences living amid climate change. Heat records are broken, then broken again. Ice retreats, then briefly stabilizes. Markets fluctuate. Policies lag behind signals. The Norse captured this ambiguity through mythic atmosphere rather than graphs. Clouds linger. Winds change direction. The sea grows restless, and beneath it all, the serpent adjusts. We pause here because this chapter is about anticipation rather than impact. The world has not yet crossed its threshold, but the approach is detectable to those who know how to listen. Systems are communicating in their own language through waves, wind, and winter. Midgard continues its routines. Boats still leave harbor. Fires still burn in longhouses, but certainty has begun to thin. In the next chapter, we will follow how these accumulating signs converge into a shared expectation, how prophecy crystallizes, how preparation gives way to inevitability, and how the serpent's quiet movement becomes the breath before release. By the time the signs accumulate into shared awareness, uncertainty gives way to recognition, because complex systems rarely fail without warning, and when multiple indicators align, environmental, social, psychological, the transition becomes inevitable, and in Norse tradition this convergence is given a name. Ragnarök, not as a single explosive moment, but as a process, a drawn-out reconfiguration in which thresholds are crossed one after another, and beneath it all, the slow, coiled presence of Jörmungandr begins to register as motion rather than potential. Modern science would describe this phase as entry into a new regime. Before this point, disturbances are absorbed. After it, feedback loops reinforce change. Ice loss accelerates warming. Warming alters circulation. Altered circulation redistributes storms. Each shift amplifies the next. The Norse expressed this cascade through imagery. Long winters known as Fimbulvetur, failing harvests, broken alliances, and seas that behave unpredictably. These are not isolated catastrophes. They are coupled failures unfolding across interconnected domains. In the North Atlantic world, such transitions would have been deeply embodied. Prolonged cold could lock harbors in ice. Shifting currents could disrupt fisheries. Stormier seas could isolate communities. Archaeological records from Northern Europe reveal episodes of contraction followed by migration, periods when settlements were abandoned, and populations moved in search of stability. Climate proxies extracted from ice cores and lake sediments show abrupt cooling events that align with these cultural disruptions. Ragnarök, in this sense, is not a supernatural anomaly. It is an environmental phase change translated into myth. As conditions deteriorate, social structures strain, trust erodes, conflict rises, kinship networks fracture. Anthropologists recognize this pattern across cultures facing prolonged ecological stress. Scarcity amplifies competition, mobility increases, norms weaken. The Norse myths capture this with stark simplicity. Brothers turn against brothers, oaths lose meaning, violence becomes commonplace. These are classic markers of systems under pressure. Within this tightening spiral, Jörmungandr's role shifts. For centuries, the serpent has functioned as boundary and regulator, maintaining the enclosure of Midgard. Now, as oceanic and atmospheric systems destabilize, that regulatory capacity weakens. The serpent begins to move, not violently at first, but enough to disturb currents and tides. In mythic language, it releases venom into sea and sky. In scientific terms, this resembles the breakdown of buffering mechanisms. Warming oceans absorb less carbon, melting ice reduces reflectivity. Altered circulation redistributes heat in unfamiliar ways. Thor, the atmospheric force, senses this change. Storms intensify. Lightning becomes more frequent. pressure systems deepen. The sky itself participates in the transition. Modern climatology describes this coupling precisely. As sea surface temperatures rise, convective energy increases, fueling stronger storms. The Norse express the same interaction through divine tension. What makes this chapter distinctive is that Ragnarök does not arrive suddenly. It breathes. There is an inhalation, years of mounting instability. Then an exhalation, rapid transformation. Seeress speak more urgently. Communities prepare not for victory but for endurance. Boats are repaired. Food is stored. Rituals intensify. These actions mirror contemporary disaster preparedness, stockpiling supplies, reinforcing infrastructure, strengthening social ties. Even when outcomes cannot be prevented, resilience can be cultivated. Yet there is also acceptance. Norse cosmology does not frame Ragnarök as something to be avoided at all costs. It is something to be met with courage. The gods themselves do not flee. They take positions. They acknowledge that certain transitions cannot be negotiated away. This is perhaps the most modern aspect of the myth, recognition that some systemic changes exceed management and must be lived through. From a documentary standpoint, this reflects an advanced understanding of limits. Not every tipping point can be reversed. Not every feedback loop can be dampened in time. Sometimes, adaptation gives way to transformation. As Jörmungandr tightens its movement beneath the waves, coastlines feel different. Tides behave unpredictably. Storm surge reaches farther inland. In human memory, these moments are remembered as years when the sea came too close, when familiar landmarks vanished, when the horizon felt unstable. The serpent stirring becomes experiential, not abstract, not symbolic, physical. We pause here because chapter 16 represents the threshold crossing. The system has entered a new state. Ragnarök is no longer prophecy alone. It is unfolding process. Environmental signals, social fracture, and mythic expectation now align. Midgard stands inside a narrowing corridor of possibility. Above, clouds thicken. Below, currents reorganize. And around the world, the great boundary begins to loosen. In the next chapter, we will follow this transition into its visible phase, when Jörmungandr finally rises from the deep, when storms and seas converge, and when the long-contained energy of planetary systems is released into motion. What follows is not sudden. It is cumulative. Because when large systems cross their thresholds, they rarely collapse in a single instant. They unravel through accelerating interaction. And in Norse tradition, this phase is marked by the moment when Jörmungandr finally breaks the surface, transforming from unseen boundary into visible force. And with that emergence, every latent imbalance between ocean and sky becomes active. From a modern scientific perspective, this moment corresponds to full feedback activation. Buffering capacity exhausted, circulation patterns disrupted, and energy long stored in water and atmosphere released through extreme events. In Earth system terms, this is what happens when warming oceans intensify storms, melting ice alters salinity, and pressure gradients sharpen across hemispheres. The Norse expressed this convergence through a single image: the serpent rising, venom spilling into sea and air, tides surging beyond familiar limits. Coastlines vanish first. Low-lying settlements are overwhelmed by storm surge. Waves penetrate far inland. Harbors that once sheltered ships become conduits for destruction. Archaeological layers from flood-prone regions often record such moments as abrupt sediment deposits, marine sand laid over terrestrial soil, shells embedded where crops once grew. These are the signatures of rapid marine incursion, and they mirror the mythic description of waters advancing across Midgard. In the narrative, Jörmungandr's ascent is inseparable from atmospheric upheaval. As the serpent emerges, clouds thicken, lightning fractures the sky, and winds accelerate across the seas. Modern climatology explains this coupling clearly. Warm, unstable oceans inject moisture and heat into the atmosphere, feeding convective systems that generate violent storms. Sea and sky become a single engine. This is where Thor enters the story. Thor does not arrive as savior. He arrives as counterforce. He represents rapid energy release, lightning, shock, impact, meeting the slow, distributed power of oceanic circulation. Their confrontation is not personal rivalry. It is the collision of two planetary regulators: atmosphere versus sea, impulse versus continuity. The myths describe Thor advancing through flood and storm, hammer raised, while the serpent coils and lashes amid towering waves. From a documentary lens, this reads like a dramatized depiction of coupled extremes: atmospheric violence superimposed on oceanic rise. Even today, the most destructive events occur when these systems synchronize, when hurricanes ride atop elevated sea levels, or when storm surge coincides with king tides. Jörmungandr's venom is said to poison sky and water alike. Scientifically, this evokes cascading contamination, saltwater intrusion into freshwater systems, sediment plumes choking coastal ecosystems, and the release of stored carbon from disturbed marine environments. When oceans warm and stratify, oxygen levels fall, dead zones expand, life retreats. The serpent's poison becomes a metaphor for biogeochemical disruption. What matters here is not the spectacle but the structure. The serpent does not destroy the world alone. It participates in a networked failure. Oceanic instability amplifies atmospheric violence. Atmospheric violence accelerates oceanic change. Each reinforces the other in tightening spiral. This is precisely how modern models describe climate tipping cascades. And within this spiral, Midgard's human systems finally fracture. Trade routes dissolve. Communities scatter. Familiar rhythms disappear. The myths speak of cities lost beneath waves, of landscapes reshaped beyond recognition. While poetic, these descriptions align with what rapid sea level rise and extreme weather can do to coastal societies. Erase infrastructure, displace populations, and force abrupt migration. Yet even now, Norse cosmology does not frame this as meaningless devastation. It frames it as release. Energy stored across centuries is finally expressed. Boundaries that once held now transform. Jörmungandr's rise marks the moment when enclosure gives way to exchange, when the ring breaks, allowing internal and external systems to mix freely. In earth science terms, this is regime shift. The old configuration dissolves. A new one begins to assemble. Thor strikes the serpent. The serpent recoils. Both are mortally engaged, but the outcome is not victory, it is transition. We pause here because Chapter 17 represents the visible phase of collapse, the point where invisible processes become undeniable, where gradual change turns abrupt, and where myth compresses centuries of environmental dynamics into a single storm-wrapped encounter. The serpent has risen. The skies have answered. Midgard stands amid flood and lightning. In the next chapter, we will follow the climax of this interaction, the final exchange between thunder and ocean, the moment when both regulators exhaust themselves, and the world passes fully through its transformational threshold. At the height of systemic release, when sea and sky have merged into a single engine of motion, the encounter between Thor and Jörmungandr becomes unavoidable, not as heroic spectacle alone, but as the final interaction between two planetary-scale regulators whose long coexistence has reached its limit. Because this is what happens when coupled systems exhaust their buffering capacity. Opposing forces converge, energy concentrates, and transformation accelerates. In Norse tradition, Thor advances through flood and gale, hammer raised, while the serpent towers from the sea, its body still tracing fragments of the world it once enclosed. From a documentary perspective, this moment compresses a vast array of processes into a single confrontation. Atmospheric instability meeting oceanic circulation, rapid energy discharge colliding with slow, distributed mass, thunder against infinity. Modern physics tells us that lightning is not merely light and sound. It is electrical rebalancing, a sudden discharge across charged gradients in unstable air. Storm systems generate immense electrical potential as warm, moist air rises and cold air descends. When that potential exceeds tolerance, it releases. Thor embodies this release. He is the visible endpoint of accumulated atmospheric tension. Jörmungandr, by contrast, embodies storage. Oceans absorb heat. They hold momentum in currents. They retain dissolved gases and nutrients. They distribute pressure across depth. For centuries, the serpent has represented this capacity to contain, to buffer, to circulate, to delay consequence. Now, as thresholds are crossed, that stored energy is no longer held quietly. It returns to the surface in wave, surge, and instability. Their clash is therefore not a duel of personalities. It is the collision of timescales. Thor moves in seconds. The serpent moves in centuries. When these scales intersect, outcomes are abrupt. The myths describe Thor striking Jörmungandr with his hammer, delivering a blow powerful enough to rupture the serpent's coils. Scientifically, This reads like an impulse applied to a massive system, a shock wave introduced into an already unstable medium. Such impulses can trigger cascading change. Undersea landslides generate tsunamis. Atmospheric pressure drops intensify cyclones. Sudden freshwater input alters ocean circulation. In systems theory, this is known as force transition. A system already near tipping point receives an external push and reorganizes rapidly. Jörmungandr responds not with resistance alone, but with release. Venom spreads through sea and sky. Waters surge higher. Winds accelerate. The serpent's body, once a continuous boundary, fragments into violent motion. The enclosure dissolves. For Midgard, this is the moment when familiar geography ceases to apply. Coastlines redraw themselves in hours. Rivers reverse under storm surge. Freshwater systems become saline. Soil erodes. Forests fall. These are the kinds of changes modern disaster science associates with compound extremes, events where multiple hazards overlap, amplifying impact beyond what any single factor could produce. Thor delivers his final strike. The serpent recoils. And yet, as Norse tradition emphasizes, Thor does not emerge unscathed. After felling Jörmungandr, he takes only a few steps before collapsing himself, overcome by the serpent's venom. This detail is essential. It encodes a principle central to environmental science. Interventions at systemic scale carry cost. Even successful containment of one destabilizing force can propagate harm elsewhere. In contemporary terms, this resembles mitigation strategies that reduce one risk while introducing another. Geoengineering proposals that cool atmosphere but alter precipitation. Dams that control floods but disrupt ecosystems. Or emergency responses that save lives while degrading long-term resilience. The myth does not present Thor as wrong. It presents consequence as unavoidable. Thunder defeats infinity, but thunder cannot survive the encounter. From a documentary standpoint, this mutual fall represents exhaustion of regulatory extremes. The atmosphere discharges its stored energy. The ocean releases its accumulated instability. Both systems reach a new, lower energy state. Violence subsides not because balance is restored, but because available tension has been spent. This is how large transitions conclude, not with harmony, with depletion. The serpent sinks back, lifeless or dispersed, no longer forming a continuous ring. Thor falls upon the transformed land. Storms begin to weaken. Waves slowly lose height. The coupled system that once held Midgard in a specific configuration has dissolved. What remains is aftermath. Sediment settles. Waters recede. Skies clear in broken intervals. From geological perspective, such moments leave enduring signatures. Thick flood deposits, rearranged coastlines, altered river channels, and ecological resets. From cultural perspective, they leave stories, trauma, and the beginnings of adaptation. The Norse encoded all of this into a single exchange between hammer and serpent. It is not triumph, it is passage. We pause here because chapter 18 marks the peak of transformation. The great boundary has been broken. The atmospheric counterforce has expended itself. Both regulators, sea and sky, have completed their roles in this cycle. Midgard, as it was, no longer exists. In the next chapter, we will move into the quiet that follows catastrophe. The receding waters, the altered landscapes, and the first signs of reorganization, examining how worlds reassemble after systemic collapse, and how Norse cosmology anticipates renewal even in the deepest silence. After the thunder fades and the last surge of water withdraws from shattered coastlines, what follows is not silence, but settling. The slow, particulate quiet that arrives when energy has been spent and systems begin to reorganize. And in Norse tradition, this interval is framed as the death of Jörmungandr and the fall of Thor. Yet from a documentary perspective, it reads as something broader. The termination of a regime, the end of a particular planetary configuration, and the beginning of a long recovery. Modern Earth science recognizes this phase as post-transition stabilization. After extreme events, mega floods, volcanic winters, abrupt climate shifts, landscapes do not immediately return to equilibrium. Rivers recut channels, sediment redistributes, vegetation recolonizes disturbed ground, marine ecosystems reassemble from surviving fragments. This period can last decades, centuries, or millennia, depending on the magnitude of disruption. It is not passive rest. It is active reconfiguration. Norse myth compresses this drawn-out process into the image of bodies on a transformed world. Thor fallen after delivering the final blow, the serpent no longer forming its enclosing ring. What matters is not which figure stands last, but that both regulators have expended themselves. The atmosphere has released its charge. The ocean has discharged its stored instability. The coupled system that once maintained Midgard's boundaries has dissolved. In systems terms, the feedback loop has closed. The energy gradient that sustained the old world is gone. What remains is aftermath. Floodwaters recede, leaving behind new coastlines traced in silt and debris. Freshwater lenses form over saline intrusions. Forest edges retreat, then advance again. In modern field studies, such landscapes show distinct signatures. Layers of marine sand inland, driftwood embedded in fields, altered soil chemistry, and reorganized estuaries. These are the fingerprints of compound events. Storm surge layered atop long-term sea level change, atmospheric violence superimposed on oceanic rise. Human communities experience this phase as disorientation. Routes once navigable are gone. Familiar harbors are reshaped. Memory no longer matches terrain. Archaeological records from regions affected by rapid environmental change consistently reveal abandonment followed by resettlement, suggesting periods when people step back from damaged zones before cautiously returning. The Norse encoded this retreat into mythic withdrawal. Survivors emerge into a quieter world, surveying what remains. Crucially, this is not portrayed as absolute annihilation. Norse cosmology insists on persistence. Even after the serpent's death and Thor's collapse, life continues. Seeds remain in soil. Fish return to shallows. Birds reappear along altered shores. The world breathes again. From a documentary standpoint, this insistence aligns with what paleobiology demonstrates across deep time. Earth has endured asteroid impacts, massive volcanic outpourings, and repeated glaciations. Each time, diversity falls sharply. Each time, recovery follows. Not identical recovery, not restoration of the same assemblages, but renewal, new ecosystems arising from surviving lineages. The serpent's death therefore signifies not the end of life, but the end of a particular configuration of circulation and boundary. Its ring no longer defines Midgard. The horizon changes. Without the enclosing coil, land and sea mix more freely. Estuaries expand. Wetlands proliferate. Nutrient flows reorganize. In ecological terms, edge habitat increases. Transitional zones widen. Such environments often foster rapid diversification, providing niches for pioneer species. Norse myth gestures toward this by emphasizing emergence after collapse, new shoots, new settlements, new alliances. Thor's fall carries parallel meaning. The atmosphere's violent release has passed. Storm intensity diminishes. Electrical tension dissipates. In modern climatology, extreme periods are often followed by relative calm as systems settle into new baselines. This does not imply safety, only that the immediate cascade has ended. Together, the deaths of thunder and serpent encode a principle central to resilience theory. Crises exhaust themselves. What follows is not restoration of the old, but construction of the new. Human societies respond accordingly. Survivors adapt tools to altered coasts. Fishing practices change as species distributions shift. Architecture evolves to meet new flood regimes. Oral tradition preserves lessons about thresholds and restraint. Memory becomes infrastructure for the next cycle. The Norse expressed this adaptive phase through sparse, powerful imagery. A washed world, a quiet horizon, and a handful of beings moving forward into uncertainty. The emphasis is not on grief, but on continuity. Even gods are subject to cycles. Only process endures. We pause here because chapter 19 marks the deep trough of the cycle, the moment after release, when energy is lowest and possibilities begin to open. The serpent is gone as boundary. Thunder is gone as counterforce. Midgard stands reconfigured, neither destroyed nor restored, but transformed. In the final chapter, we will follow what rises from this stillness. The return of green to land, the reweaving of human and ecological networks, and the enduring lesson encoded in the world's serpent, that every ending carries the blueprint of a beginning. When the turbulence finally withdraws and the altered seas find new levels, what remains is not emptiness, but possibility, because in Norse cosmology, the end of one configuration is always the opening of another. And although Jörmungandr no longer holds the world in its ancient coil, the processes it embodied do not vanish. They reorganize, redistribute, and return in quieter forms, carrying forward the lesson that boundaries change, but circulation endures. Modern ecology recognizes this phase as succession. After disturbance, pioneer species arrive first: hardy grasses, fast-growing shrubs, microorganisms that stabilize soil and reestablish nutrient flow. Over time, complexity returns. Forests rise, wetlands expand, coastal marshes form where floodwaters once surged. In marine systems, plankton blooms follow nutrient-rich runoff, feeding new food webs that eventually support fish, birds, and mammals. Recovery does not replicate the past. It invents a future from what survives. Norse tradition compresses centuries of this regeneration into a handful of images: green shoots pushing through silt, clear skies breaking after long darkness, and small groups of survivors stepping cautiously into reshaped landscapes. These figures are not conquerors of a ruined world. They are participants in reassembly. The serpent's absence as a single enclosing body does not mean the end of cycles. It means their diffusion. Without a visible ring around Midgard, circulation becomes less centralized and more distributed. Estuaries widen, rivers braid, new shorelines emerge, edge habitats proliferate. In scientific terms, this creates mosaics of ecological opportunity. Diversity increases in transitional zones. Human communities adapt to new coastlines, rebuilding harbors, redefining routes, and reestablishing exchange with altered seas. From a documentary standpoint, this is where myth aligns most closely with resilient science. Systems that survive collapse do so by reorganizing, not by returning to exact prior states. Memory persists in structure, seed banks in soil, genetic diversity in remnant populations, cultural knowledge carried in story. The Norse encoded this persistence in the idea that even after Ragnarök, life continues. The gods themselves do not all vanish. Some remain, others are reborn. The world is not wiped clean, it is rewritten. This emphasis matters. It teaches that catastrophe is not absolute erasure, it is transition. Human psychology shifts accordingly. Instead of seeking permanence, cultures learn to value continuity of relationship, between people and land, between sea and sky, between past and future. Responsibility becomes intergenerational. Actions are weighed not only by immediate benefit, but by how they echo forward. In modern terms, this perspective mirrors sustainability thinking. We now understand that atmospheric carbon persists for centuries, that ocean heat content carries tomorrow's storms, that land use decisions shape watersheds far downstream. The Norse captured this temporal reach through the serpent. Pull at one point, and the effect travels the long way around before returning. Even in the serpent's death, that lesson remains. Its body no longer defines the horizon, but its logic persists in currents, winds, and memory. Children grow up in a quieter world, hearing stories of storms that reshaped coasts and thunder that split seas. They learn to read weather with care. They learn to treat shorelines as living margins. They inherit a worldview that expects change and prepares for it, that recognizes thresholds, and that honors the necessity of adaptation. From a scientific perspective, this final chapter affirms what Earth system research continues to reveal. Planets are dynamic. Stability is temporary. Life endures by learning to move with change rather than against it. And so the documentary closes not with silence but with renewal. Water recedes, sediment settles, roots take hold. Birds return to newly formed wetlands. Boats venture once more into reconfigured bays. The world does not resume as it was. It becomes what it must. This is the enduring legacy of the world serpent, not as monster, not as God, but as model, a living diagram of circulation, feedback, and return. A reminder that boundaries breathe, that oceans remember, that thunder answers, and that every ending, when traced far enough around the circle, reveals itself as another beginning.